Hey guys, it's Mr. Schmidt here, and in this video, we're going to look at tips for completing AP Micro FRQ or free response questions. So, free response questions make up uh, 1/3 of your AP exam score. There'll be one long free response question and then two short free response question. Um, and so what I wanted to do in this video is really just look at ways to help you be successful in free response questions since they operate obviously differently than multiple choice. And so I want to go over 5 tips to help you do that. So the first one is know your verb. So every question on an FRQ or every part of an FRQ will typically incorporate some type of a verb that is telling you what it wants you to do with that question. So, for example, if we have calculate, so this means show your work, right? You need to show your math. Because what sometimes can happen, and I did have this happen with a student a few years ago, is you can come up with the right answer, you can't really explain how you got it, right? And so what AP really wants to know is that not only can you get the right answer, but that they know that you didn't just guess, that there's work there. And that's really important to remember with the most recent change to the AP micro exam, which is you can use a calculator now. So it can be really easy to, do all the work on the calculator, write the correct answer, and forget to show that work. So even though you can use a calculator on the AP micro exam, it's really important that you remember to show that work. Another very common verb that you'll see is draw, and that means make a graph. We'll talk about graphs here in a minute, but that's what draw means. Explain, you see this one a lot as well, which means write why something is true. So kind of inserting that word because, right? So if I said, okay, you know, John has the comparative advantage in producing textbooks. Okay, well, why does John have that comparative advantage? Explain. So I would say, okay, John's got the comparative advantage because, and then give my reason, right? So basically it means give a reason to prove why what you're saying is true. Show means put on a graph. We really haven't encountered this kind of task up to this point in the course, but you'll see it later. And then finally, identify is really a catch-all for any question where it doesn't have another verb. And really what that means is that you just say the answer and you don't explain, right? You just say what it is and you move on. It's like state, right? And so sometimes, basically if a question doesn't have a verb, assume that that verb is identify. All right, so let's look at tip 2, which is does it say to explain? And this is something you're going to often hear me say, which is if a question does not say to explain, don't, right? Because the problem with that is if you have a correct answer, but your explanation is wrong, in many cases, depending upon the AP reader, you're not going to get credit, right? And so you have to make sure to be very careful with your answers. If it is tempting because students feel like if they just say the answer but they don't explain, that that's somehow not enough and they're going to lose points, but that's not the case at all. In fact, on the AP micro exam, less is often more. Like you want to just say enough to get your point across and then move on. So if it doesn't say to explain, don't. Tip number 3 deals with labels and arrows. So every axis, every curve should have a label, and every curve shift should have an arrow. This is very, very important. I always tell students that I would rather you miss points because you don't know which way the curve shifts, as opposed to you forgot the arrow, right? We don't want to lose points on a free response question for very silly errors that could have been easily corrected. So make sure every axis, every curve, it's got a label. Every curve shift has an arrow. Tip number 4 is make sure you're answering the question that you're being asked. Sometimes students will, they'll jot down an answer, but then when you read it, it's like, yeah, but that's not what was being asked, right? The other thing here is make sure it's clear which part of the question you're answering. So with a typical free response question, there's multiple parts. They go in alphabetical order, so part A, part B, part C, and so on. And so make sure that it is very clear what part of the question you're answering. And speaking of writing, I'll go ahead and say this, even though it's on a separate tip, make sure you write legibly. Because if the AP reader, the person who grades the FRQ section on the AP exam, if they cannot read your writing, they will not be able to give you credit. So make sure your writing is legible and clear so that the AP reader can understand what you're saying. And then finally, the last tip is, kind of a catch-all for all exams, quizzes, tests that you'll take in any class, which is check your work. Especially the free response question, free response section, I should say, of the AP exam, because when you get to the AP exam in May, and it's a 2-hour exam, and you're at the free response section, and you're tired, and you want to be done, it's tempting to just do the questions, close the booklet, whatever the case may be, and just move on. But I encourage you, please check your work because you don't want to leave the AP exam thinking, oh, did I forget that label? Did I forget that arrow? Did I forget to explain? And lose points that you wouldn't have had you just gone back and checked. And so it's very important. Read each question carefully, check your work, and you're going to be successful on the AP Micro Exams free response section. So that's all for this video on tips for completing AP Micro FRQs. Until next time, have a great day.